welcome to Cinemaholics. I'm Jon Negroni, your usual co-host on the main show, and I'm here to do an instant take of the new movie, Anora. Now, of course, my instant take reviews are very different from our in-depth reviews. This is a straight out of the theater reaction. Not going to go into a ton of very plot-heavy details. Of course, no spoilers or anything like that. But I will kind of give you some context for the movie and what I thought of it. I want to start with the very, very general version of what I think, because first and foremost, I do really believe that Anora is best experienced as cold as you can. If you have not seen a trailer, for example, or any clips, or maybe read a synopsis, that's great. Please just watch the movie. I think that this is one of those films that's best experienced organically, where you don't really know what you're in for. That's how I experienced it. I purposely avoided any and all marketing for the film. I only saw a poster for the movie at one point, and I tried not to really focus on it. So I knew Mikey Madison was in this movie as the main character, Anora, or Annie, as the character wants to be called. And I knew that Sean Baker would be directing, which of course has me instantly interested. Sean Baker is truly one of my favorite filmmakers working right now. I've loved every single one of his films that he's made. And before we get into all of that, like I said, just going to give you my general reaction. Love this movie. Really, really well done. I truly enjoyed it from start to finish. One of those rare times where I'm just watching this movie and I'm not thinking about anything else. I'm not thinking about the world outside of the movie. I am just following this train ride to its final destination every step of the way. There are certainly some things that I could get into where I wouldn't even call them criticisms necessarily, but certainly thought-provoking moments and topics of discussion that definitely have me thinking a lot about what other people might say and think about the movie. But all that said, that was my sort of general reaction to the movie. Let me talk about it in a little bit more detail if you're really curious. But again, if you're sold on it and you already know that you want to see this, if you, like me, have already watched and enjoyed many Sean Baker films over the years, then you don't need to know anything else, in my opinion. I think you should just go ahead and check it out. Now, okay, Anora is a very simple film at the very beginning of it. It's not a complicated story. If anything, it's sort of like two halves of a movie kind of put together, and that actually serves the story quite well. Now, if you've been following Sean Baker's work over the years, you'll know that he has this kind of working class empathy that he always tries to imbue in his screenplays, in his scripts. And that's one of the things I appreciate the most about his work. I think that unlike a lot of other filmmakers, he really seems to just have an authentic and genuine appreciation for the unseen Americans in this country. He's an American filmmaker who I just think gets Americana in a way that I just don't see in a lot of other films like this, at least not frequently. Every once in a while, you might get something like Bloody Nose, Empty Pockets, for example, or you might get something like Honey. But I don't know, Sean Baker just does it a little differently, because sometimes I think when you do get those films that tackle the sort of folks who are, working class, lower class, poor, whatever, and they're, they live rough lives and all of that, I feel like a lot of the time those movies, they trauma dump on us. They really capitalize on the capitalism, I guess, or, all of the emotional abuse and the darkness of all that stuff. Whereas I don't really see that in Sean Baker's work. He finds, of course, there's the darkness, there's the emotionality, there's the sadness, I guess, but there's also a lot of humor. There's also just kind of what it's really like to live day to day as that kind of person. You do see the joy and the revelry in that. You've seen that in films, of course, Tangerine, Florida Project. I think that Red Rocket, I've truly enjoyed that movie because I felt like that was just Sean Baker really just getting into an allegory in a way that I hadn't quite seen him do before. Really just getting to the heart of like American politics and how these things are viewed by everyday people, but doing it in the backdrop of the porn industry. Now, that said, when you watch a movie like Anora, it's also a movie that is commenting on sex work. And in this case, we follow an escort who works at a strip club named Anora. She speaks Russian, and we get kind of a glimpse into her life in the early part of the movie. But things really get going when she starts to get sucked into the world of this very rich Russian heir, basically, who is very spoiled, but he's also very fun-loving. And we start to see Anora just kind of get to revel in the high life. Lots of parties, lots of wild, extravagant lifestyle changes for her, but then it all comes to a head in expectantly intense ways. This is a movie that takes place in New York City, and, the previous films, we've had Florida Project, of course, was in Orlando, speaking very much of Disney and everything. I forget where Tangerine took place. I believe it was, maybe it was LA, but it's been a while since I watched that movie, so be sure to fact check me. And then, of course, Red Rocket took place in Texas. And here with New York City, you see Baker doing something very similar with that location, showing us one side of it, which is the glitzy, the gloss, the party lifestyle. But we do also get a ton of the other side of New York City, the sort of Russian mobster side. It's always overcast. The weather is oppressive. When you go to Coney Island, there's a lot of joking around in terms of how cold the water is, stuff like that. And I think it's just those little moments, those little scenes that allow us to kind of enter Anora's mindset throughout the movie. And that's really what this film is getting at. It's unpacking the mind of a woman sort of at a very unique crossroads in her life, trying to essentially find happiness, but not really quite sure where this roller coaster that she's on is going to lead. It's one of those things that I'm talking around it, of course, but I just really was thrilled by this movie. It's not a film that does anything all that intense throughout. There are some intense scenes, to be clear, and definitely some scenes where I was like wincing for sure, but not all the way through. It's more sort of at times almost making light of some of the violence happening on screen, which I have a feeling could upset some folks or be considered maybe a little bit problematic by some people. I'm not sure. For me, I definitely had a few of those complicated feelings, but it was less, I think, me analyzing or judging the director in this case, and more so me kind of evaluating the way films usually tackle this kind of subject matter. And how sometimes there is that genre of film, especially like indie film, that does make light of crime and comedy or violence and things like that. I'm thinking of like Coen Brothers movies, for example. So there was something there's an interesting layer to that as well. But yeah, I mean, I love movies that are like this, that seem like we're getting a pretty typical story structure, but then everything kind of turns on its head, and it's way more experimental of a film than I expected. I don't want to make it sound like it's wild and weird or anything. It is a pretty standard film in a lot of ways, but that's not a bad thing. I think that it's standard in the sense that, it's easy to follow along. I think it's fun to follow along and, again, be so immersed in what's happening. And I just really fell for this main character, Anora, played by Mikey Madison. There's another character too in here who comes to play a little bit later in the film. His name is Igor, and I don't know the actor who plays him. And by the way, that's another thing I just really, really appreciate about this film, is just virtually all unknown actors. Not a lot of recognizable faces unless you are much better versed in that sort of thing than me. I wouldn't be surprised if Baker cast a lot of virtual unknowns, because he is known to do that quite a bit. He did discover, Brooklyn Prince, right, in Florida Project, and I want to say Red Rocket. I mean, besides the main guy, of course, a lot of the characters in that film were actors who had maybe not even worked before, not worked much. And so he's very good at just finding that talent. But again, Anora, it's one of those movies that I think will probably be compared to other films like Uncut Gems, for example. I don't know if that's the fairest comparison, but it's a decent start to kind of get you in the mindset of what you're in for. I do like that Baker this time around is working with a more likable protagonist, even though she is, of course, very chaotic and very compelling in that way, in the way that she can be her own antagonist at times. But yeah, definitely not a Safdie Brothers type of movie. Don't want to set your expectations incorrectly there. But yeah, I really, really dug this one. Definitely going to go down as one of my favorites of the year. Definitely in my top 10. And I can see why it's getting so much awards attention. This is definitely a big win for Neon, I think. I have a feeling it's going to do well or, garner some attention. I don't know if it'll garner a ton of attention at the Academy Awards. That'd be interesting and cool to see. But certainly with like Critics' Choice and all of that, I could see a lot of critics really going to bat for this movie and for good reason. But that's just my take, of course, my instant reaction. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about Anora sometime on the main show. Not sure when Will Ashton is going to see this one. I think he's interested in watching it, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, stay tuned, of course, to the podcast. We'll be back soon to talk about whatever else is coming out. There's lots on the horizon for us. But for now, I'm going to call it here. Thank you so much for listening to Cinemaholics. Don't forget, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I hope you do. And you can email the show, cinemaholicspodcast@gmail.com, or check us out on Discord. You can hang out with the gang on the Discord channel, which is linked in the show notes, as always. All right, folks. See you next time.